Welcome back to Comic Facts. Today, we're diving into the other side of the story, the rise and evolution of comic book villains. These aren't just foils for heroes. Over the decades, they've become complex, compelling, and in some cases, even more fascinating than the heroes themselves. This is one of those videos you can put on in the background while you work, study, or relax, and still catch the ideas, history, and cultural impact as it unfolds. For decades, villains were often simple. They had a plan, a costume, and a motivation that could usually be summed up in a sentence. Stop the villain, save the day, repeat. But by the 1990s and into the 2000s, both comics and film began pushing beyond that simplicity. Villains started to reflect more than just evil. They reflected humanity, society, and even the heroes themselves. Today, we'll explore how that evolution happened. From early archetypes to morally complex antagonists, from characters who existed only to be defeated, to villains who challenged the very idea of heroism itself. We'll look at figures like Magneto, whose ideology forces us to question who's really right, the Joker, whose chaos exposes the fragility of order, and modern icons like Loki and Thanos, who blend charm, philosophy, and personal stakes in ways that made them unforgettable. Along the way, we'll also examine how design, tone, and storytelling help villains become central to narratives, not just obstacles to overcome. Because understanding the evolution of villains isn't just about comics. It's about how stories reflect morality, ambition, power, and consequence. Where it all began. To understand where comic book villains are today, we need to start at the beginning. In the earliest comics of the 1930s and 40s, villains were often simple, even cartoonish. They had exaggerated personalities, clear motivations, and very little moral complexity. Think early mob bosses, mad scientists, or the Joker's first appearances. Their purpose was straightforward: give the hero someone to stop. Audiences didn't expect nuance, and the stories didn't need it. But as comics matured, so did their antagonists. By the 1960s and 70s, creators began experimenting with psychology, ideology, and personal stakes. Magneto is the perfect example. Introduced as a traditional X-Men villain, his backstory as a Holocaust survivor reframed everything. His fight wasn't rooted in chaos or greed. It was born from trauma, fear, and the desire to protect his people at any cost. Suddenly, villains weren't just enemies. They were mirrors, reflecting the hero's ideals, fears, and limitations. The rise of moral complexity. The 1980s pushed this even further. Characters like Kingpin and Daredevil, and darker interpretations of the Joker, became psychologically complex, morally ambiguous, and disturbingly human. Their goals weren't always global domination. Sometimes they were about control, obsession, or proving a philosophical point. This shift allowed comics to explore morality, consequence, and ethical tension in ways earlier eras never could. By the 1990s, this evolution accelerated alongside the rise of anti-heroes. Characters like Blade and Eric Draven blurred the line between hero and monster, and villains evolved to match that tone. Antagonists became charismatic, relatable, and sometimes ideologically justified. Thanos, with his cosmic ambition and twisted logic, and Loki, driven by jealousy, identity, and grief, are direct descendants of this era. Even villain design evolved. Gothic aesthetics, stylized costumes, and thematic visuals weren't just for shock value. They communicated personality, morality, and narrative stakes. Blade's vampires, the Crow's gang, and other 90s antagonists weren't just threats. They were extensions of the worlds they inhabited. Villains take center stage. By the 2000s and 2010s, comic book villains had fully stepped into the spotlight. No longer just obstacles, they became central to stories, stealing scenes, driving narratives, and in some cases, defining entire franchises. Loki in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a perfect example. Introduced as a scheming trickster, he quickly became a fan favorite. His humor, charm, and emotional vulnerability blurred the line between villain and hero, proving that motivation matters just as much as action. Then there's Thanos. His goal, wiping out half the universe, is horrifying, but his reasoning is presented as logical, even philosophical. Villains like Thanos show that modern audiences respond to antagonists who feel intelligent, ideologically driven, and emotionally invested. And of course, the Joker in The Dark Knight became a cultural phenomenon, not because of what he wanted, but because of what he represented: chaos, uncertainty, a challenge to the very idea of order. Even ensemble films like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse ensure their villains have depth, backstory, and motivation, reinforcing the idea that great heroes require equally compelling antagonists. Why villains matter. Modern villains don't just fight heroes physically, they challenge them morally and philosophically. They force audiences to ask uncomfortable questions. Who's right? Who's justified? And where does the line between hero and villain really lie? This evolution mirrors a broader shift in storytelling. Audiences crave complexity, they expect nuance, and they're drawn to characters who reflect the contradictions of the real world. Heroes and villains are two sides of the same coin. As protagonists grew darker and more layered, villains had to evolve alongside them. Without that balance, stories feel hollow. With it, they feel alive. And that's the evolution of comic book villains. From simple, one-dimensional antagonists to complex, morally nuanced figures who challenge heroes, audiences, and storytelling itself. From mob bosses and mad scientists to characters like Magneto, Loki, and Thanos, villains have grown alongside anti-heroes and morally complex protagonists, shaping the stories we love in ways we often take for granted. They're not just obstacles, they're reflections of society, mirrors for heroes, and often the most fascinating characters in the story. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, a huge shout out to our editors and writers whose work makes these deep dives possible. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And keep following Comic Facts, because when it comes to heroes, anti-heroes, and villains, the story is never really over. It just keeps evolving.